London, 1873. The gas lamps flicker in drawing rooms across Mayfair as women gather for afternoon tea. But there's something different about today's gathering. One chair remains conspicuously empty. The hostess doesn't explain why. She doesn't need to. Everyone knows. And everyone understands that what happened to the absent woman could happen to any of them if they're not careful. You see, in Victorian society, a woman's reputation wasn't just important, it was everything. It was currency, armor, and prison all at once. And there was one particular thing, one specific behavior that women accepted, tolerated, even participated in during the earlier decades of the 19th century, that by the height of the Victorian era became absolutely forbidden. Not illegal, mind you, but something far worse. Socially lethal. What changed? Why did something once acceptable become the kiss of death for a respectable woman's standing in society? And more importantly, what happened to those who didn't get the memo in time? The answer reveals one of the darkest aspects of Victorian social psychology: the invisible rules that governed women's lives. Rules that could be bent in private, but never, ever acknowledged in public. Rules that could destroy a family's fortune, a daughter's marriage prospects, and a woman's entire future with nothing more than a whisper and a turned back. But before we reveal what this forbidden thing was, you need to understand how the game was played. Because Victorian morality wasn't really about morality at all. It was about power, control, and the preservation of a social order that was already beginning to crack. Imagine you're a woman in 1850. You're 23 years old, unmarried, but not yet considered a lost cause. Your family isn't wealthy, but you're genteel. You have what they call breeding. You've been taught to play the pianoforte adequately, to speak French poorly, and to never, under any circumstances, reveal what you actually think about anything important. Your mother has spent the last 5 years trying to position you in the right social circles. Every tea party, every ball, every afternoon walk in Hyde Park is a carefully orchestrated performance. You're not looking for love, you're hunting, and the prey is a husband with enough income to keep you and your future children comfortable. This is the world where the rules mattered more than the reality, where appearance trumped truth every single time, and where certain behaviors could be overlooked as long as they remained invisible to the broader social network. In the early decades of the 19th century, the rule we're discussing today wasn't really a rule at all. It was more like a guideline, a suggestion, something that refined people simply didn't do in excess, but that wasn't necessarily scandalous if done discreetly. But by the 1860s and 70s, everything had changed. The Victorian moral panic had reached its fever pitch. The cult of domesticity had transformed the ideal woman into something barely human. She was supposed to be pure, pious, submissive, and domestic. Any deviation from this template marked you as dangerous, fallen, irredeemable. And the thing that was once tolerated, it became the ultimate test of a woman's moral character, a line that separated the respectable from the ruined with brutal clarity. Let me tell you about Caroline Norden. Not because she's the woman who violated this rule, but because her story shows you exactly how the Victorian social machine destroyed women who stepped outside the invisible boundaries, even when they'd done nothing wrong. Caroline was brilliant, beautiful, and married to a cruel man who beat her and took her children. When she dared to leave him, when she dared to publish writing under her own name, when she dared to fight in court for custody of her own sons, society turned on her. Not because she was wrong, but because she'd become visible. She'd drawn attention to herself. She'd refused to suffer in silence like a proper woman should. The whispers started. The invitations stopped. Women she'd known for years crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Why? Because association with a scandalous woman was itself scandalous. Reputation was contagious, and no one wanted to catch what Caroline had. But Caroline's crime was defiance. The thing we're talking about today was different. It was more insidious because it was something women actually wanted to do, something that brought them pleasure, relief, even joy. And that's precisely why it had to be forbidden. Are you starting to understand? The Victorian moral code wasn't designed to make women virtuous. It was designed to make them controllable. And anything that gave women too much independence, too much pleasure that didn't involve men, too much of a life outside the domestic sphere became automatically suspect. By the mid-Victorian era, doctors were writing medical texts warning about the dangers of this behavior. Clergymen were preaching sermons about its moral corruption. Women's magazines were publishing cautionary tales about respectable ladies who'd indulged and paid terrible prices. The propaganda was relentless, and it worked because the message was clear. If you do this thing, if you accept this invitation, if you cross this line, you're not just being improper, you're revealing something dark and uncontrollable in your nature. You're showing the world that you're not really a lady at all. Let me paint you a scene. It's 1875 now. You're at a dinner party. The conversation is polite, bland, suffocating in its propriety. The men retire to the smoking room after the meal, leaving the women in the drawing room. Someone mentions that a mutual acquaintance has been seen engaging in the behavior we're discussing. The room goes silent. Not shocked silent, knowing silent. One woman says, "I'm not surprised. She always had a certain quality about her." Another nods. Her mother never properly supervised her. A third woman, the one whose opinion matters most because her husband has a title, delivers the final judgment. "I don't think we can continue the association. You understand." And just like that, it's done. The woman in question, who isn't even present to defend herself, has been excommunicated from respectable society. Her name will be removed from invitation lists. Her daughters will find it harder to make good matches. If she has sons, they might be blackballed from the better clubs. The contamination spreads through the entire family tree. What could she have done that was so terrible? What behavior could possibly justify this social execution? Here's where the psychology gets truly dark. The thing itself wasn't actually harmful. It didn't hurt anyone. It didn't break any laws. It wasn't even particularly unusual in other countries or in lower social classes. But for the Victorian middle and upper classes, it represented something they couldn't tolerate. A woman choosing her own pleasure, her own comfort, her own desires over the approval of the social order. And now, we're going to reveal what it was. But first, I want you to understand why this matters today, why we're not just discussing some quaint historical curiosity. Because the mechanism that made this behavior unacceptable, the social technology of reputation destruction, the way communities police women's behavior through exclusion and shame, none of that has actually disappeared. It's just changed its costume. The Victorian ladies who ruthlessly enforced these rules believed they were protecting morality, preserving civilization, keeping chaos at bay. They believed the lie that their cruelty was kindness, that their judgment was justice. They couldn't see that they were just participants in a system designed to keep them small, afraid, and obedient. So what was it? What could a respectable Victorian lady never accept again once the rules had changed? Receiving male visitors while unchaperoned. You might be thinking, that's it? That's the great forbidden thing? But wait, let me explain why this was so much more devastating than it sounds. In the early 1800s, particularly in more relaxed social circles, it wasn't uncommon for a married woman or even a young woman living with family to receive male callers when other family members were in the house, but not necessarily in the same room. As long as the door remained open, as long as someone was within earshot, it was considered acceptable. The rules were flexible. The focus was on preventing actual impropriety, not on maintaining an appearance of impossibility. But by the height of the Victorian era, this had changed completely. A respectable woman could not receive a man who wasn't family unless she had another woman present in the same room. Not in the house, not upstairs, in the exact same room, serving as what they called a chaperone. The shift happened gradually, then suddenly. And it happened because Victorian society had become obsessed with the idea of feminine purity taken to its logical extreme. It wasn't enough that a woman was virtuous, she had to appear incapable of virtue's opposite. She had to be so carefully guarded, so thoroughly supervised, that the very possibility of a misstep was eliminated. A woman who received a male visitor alone, even for 5 minutes, even with servants present, even with her husband expected home any moment, was declaring something unacceptable, that she trusted her own judgment, that she believed herself capable of managing a social interaction without supervision, that she didn't need another woman to protect her virtue because her virtue protected itself. This was the crime. Not sexual impropriety, but autonomy. Not wickedness, but independence. Not immorality, but the suggestion that a woman might be a complete person who could make her own decisions about whom to speak with in her own home. The consequences were swift and brutal. A woman seen allowing a man into her home without a chaperone would find herself cut off from respectable society within days. It didn't matter if the man was her brother's friend. It didn't matter if he'd come to discuss business with her husband. It didn't matter if the meeting was perfectly innocent. What mattered was that she'd broken the rule, and breaking the rule meant she couldn't be trusted. But here's what makes this truly insidious. The rule was impossible to follow perfectly. Situations arose. A male doctor might need to call when no other woman was available. A solicitor might need to discuss urgent business. A family friend might stop by unexpectedly. In these moments, women faced an impossible choice: break the rule and face social consequences, or follow the rule and potentially harm their family's practical interests. The system was designed to be unwinnable, because a system that women can't win is a system that keeps them dependent, anxious, and controllable. There's a letter from 1868 written by a young woman named Elizabeth to her sister. Elizabeth had allowed her brother's business partner into her drawing room while her mother was at the market. The visit lasted 10 minutes. The man delivered papers her brother needed to sign. He left. A neighbor saw him enter and leave. Within 3 days, Elizabeth's engagement was broken. The young man's mother had heard about the unchaperoned visit and declared that Elizabeth was not the sort of girl her son should marry. Elizabeth's mother was hysterical. Her father was coldly furious. Her reputation was permanently damaged. She never married. She spent the rest of her life as a dependent relative in various family members' homes, a cautionary tale about the importance of following the rules. The tragedy isn't that Elizabeth was actually guilty of anything. The tragedy is that everyone involved knew she wasn't. But that didn't matter. The rule was more important than the reality. The appearance was more valuable than the truth, and Elizabeth had to be sacrificed. To prove that the system worked, that the rules had teeth, that other young women would think twice before making the same mistake. This is the dark heart of Victorian morality. It wasn't about making people good. It was about making people afraid. And fear is a much more reliable control mechanism than virtue. The medical establishment supported this rule enthusiastically. Doctors wrote that unchaperoned contact between men and women could lead to nervous excitement that was dangerous for female health. They claimed that women's delicate constitutions couldn't handle the stimulation of male company without another woman present to somehow absorb or dilute the dangerous energy. This was pseudoscience dressed up as medical fact, but it served a purpose. It gave the social rule the weight of scientific authority. If unchaperoned meetings weren't just improper, but actually dangerous to women's health, then women who broke the rule weren't just immoral, they were self-destructive. And women who were self-destructive couldn't be trusted with anything important. The clergy reinforced the message from another angle. They preached that women were naturally weaker vessels, more susceptible to temptation, more easily led astray. A woman alone with a man was a woman in spiritual danger. The chaperone wasn't just a social convention. She was a spiritual necessity, a guardian angel in taffeta and pearls. Meanwhile, the women's magazines, those arbiters of respectable femininity, published endless stories about the consequences of breaking the rule. The rule was a luxury good. Only women whose families could afford to keep them idle, whose time had no economic value, whose entire purpose was to be ornamental and marriageable, only these women were held to the impossible standard. And that was the point. The rule separated those who mattered from those who didn't. It was a class marker disguised as a moral principle. Some women found ways around it. They developed elaborate systems of signals, a door left open at a precise angle, a servant instructed to interrupt at regular intervals, a sister or friend stationed in the next room, technically present but not actually supervising. These workarounds allowed for private conversations while maintaining the appearance of propriety. But even these compromises were dangerous because Victorian society didn't just punish the rule breakers, it punished anyone who made rule breaking look too easy. A woman who was too clever at circumventing the chaperone requirement would find herself suspect in a different way. She'd be seen as manipulative, scheming, the kind of woman who knew too much about how to deceive. You couldn't win. That was the design. You were either so rigidly supervised that you had no autonomy whatsoever, or you were clever enough to carve out small spaces of freedom and therefore not to be trusted. Either way, you were controlled. The psychological toll was immense. Women reported feeling constantly watched, constantly judged, constantly aware that a single mistake could undo everything. They developed what we now recognize as anxiety disorders. They became hyper-vigilant about social rules, obsessive about appearances, terrified of spontaneity. This was considered healthy. A woman who was nervous about protecting her reputation was a woman who would protect it. Fear was the goal, not an unfortunate side effect. And for women who did break the rule, whether by choice or by circumstance, the aftermath was devastating. They were cut off from their social networks, which for Victorian women meant being cut off from everything. Women's lives were their relationships. Without social acceptance, they had no marriage prospects, no financial security, no future. Some women who lost their reputations over this rule ended up in truly desperate circumstances. They couldn't work in respectable occupations because no respectable family would employ them. They couldn't marry because no respectable man would have them. Some ended up in workhouses. Some ended up in prostitution, which was grimly ironic because the rule they'd broken was designed to prevent exactly that fate. The Victorian moral system created the very problems it claimed to solve. By making the rules so rigid and the consequences so severe, it ensured that women who made even innocent mistakes were pushed into genuine desperation. The social safety net was made of razor wire. Now, here's the truly disturbing part. Everyone knew this system was cruel and illogical. The private letters, diaries, and memoirs of Victorian people, including the ones who most strictly enforced these rules, reveal constant doubt, frustration, and awareness that the standards were often unjust. But they enforced them anyway. Because the system wasn't really about protecting women, it was about maintaining a particular social order. And that order required women to be dependent, fearful, and carefully controlled. The rule about chaperones was one piece of a much larger puzzle. Women couldn't inherit property on the same terms as men. They couldn't vote. They had no legal rights within marriage. They couldn't access most forms of education or employment. Every aspect of Victorian society was designed to ensure that women remained under male authority, whether that of fathers, husbands, brothers, or sons. The chaperone rule specifically attacked one of the few areas where women might have exercised some independence, their social relationships. By requiring constant supervision during any interaction with men, Victorian society ensured that women couldn't form alliances, negotiate agreements, or conduct any business without male knowledge and approval. This is why the rule became stricter over time rather than more relaxed. As women began to push for more rights, as the first women's rights movements emerged, the social establishment pushed back by tightening the informal rules that governed women's daily lives. If you can't change the laws fast enough to keep women in their place, you can at least make the social consequences of independence so severe that most women won't dare to try. The women who did dare, who broke the chaperone rule and other social conventions, who lived through the scandal and survived, these women often became the backbone of the early feminist movement. They'd already lost their reputations. They had nothing left to lose, so they became dangerous. They told the truth about the system. They exposed its cruelty and its arbitrary nature. And slowly, painfully, over decades, the rule began to lose its power. Not because people suddenly became more enlightened, but because the economic and social conditions that made it possible changed. As more women entered the workforce out of necessity, as the middle class expanded and old social hierarchies began to break down, as new technologies and urban living made constant chaperonage less practical, the rule became impossible to enforce universally. It didn't disappear overnight. Even in the early 20th century, respectable women were expected to be chaperoned in many situations. But the absolute power of the rule, its ability to destroy a woman's entire life, that began to fade. What replaced it? Different rules, different forms of control, different ways of limiting women's autonomy. The specific mechanisms change, but the underlying pattern remains. Women's behavior is policed more strictly than men's. Women's reputations are more fragile, and women pay higher prices for the same actions. This is why understanding Victorian morality matters, not because we're still using chaperones, but because we're still using reputation as a weapon. We're still judging women by impossible standards. We're still punishing female autonomy while calling it protection. We've just updated the vocabulary. The Victorian lady who couldn't accept an unchaperoned male visitor has modern descendants. They face different rules with the same underlying logic. Behave correctly or be destroyed. Maintain the appearance of propriety or lose everything. Submit to social control or be labeled dangerous. And just like in Victorian times, the women who enforce these rules most strictly are often themselves trapped by them. They police other women because they're terrified of being policed themselves. They judge harshly because they know how harsh judgment can be. They defend the system because they can't imagine surviving outside it. Breaking these cycles requires first understanding them. The Victorian chaperone rule seemed natural and necessary to the people who lived under it. They'd convinced themselves it was about morality, protection, and social order. They couldn't see that it was about power and control. What rules are we following right now that future generations will look back on with the same bewilderment? What behaviors are we punishing without examining why? What social mechanisms are we using to keep certain groups of people small, afraid, and manageable? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the same questions that a thoughtful Victorian woman might have asked if she'd been able to step outside her conditioning long enough to see the system clearly. Very few could. The pressure was too intense. The consequences of deviation were too severe, and the propaganda was too effective. But some did. Some Victorian women looked at the chaperone rule and the 1,000 other restrictions on their lives and said, "This is wrong. This is cruel. This serves no purpose except to control us." And they fought back, often at enormous personal cost. Their resistance matters, not because it immediately changed everything, but because it planted seeds, because it showed that the system wasn't natural or inevitable, because it proved that women who broke the rules didn't actually become the monsters they'd been warned about. The Victorian lady who dared to receive a male visitor without a chaperone and survived the scandal discovered something powerful. She was still herself. The rule hadn't been protecting her virtue. It had been limiting her freedom. And once you see that clearly, you can never fully unsee it. This is the real lesson of Victorian morality. Not that people in the past were more virtuous or more corrupt than we are now, but that every society creates elaborate systems of control and then pretends those systems are natural law. And the first step in changing those systems is recognizing them for what they are. So the next time you hear about a rule that seems designed to protect but actually restricts, ask yourself, who benefits from this rule? Who does it control? And what would happen if we just stopped following it? The Victorian chaperone might be gone, but the impulse that created it, the desire to control women's autonomy by policing their social interactions and threatening their reputations, that impulse is still alive. It just wears different clothes now. And understanding how it worked then helps us recognize how it works now. That's why history matters, not as a curiosity, but as a warning. The respectable Victorian lady who couldn't accept an unchaperoned visitor wasn't following that rule because she was moral. She was following it because she was afraid. And fear is a terrible foundation for any moral system. True morality doesn't require chaperones. It requires thinking for yourself, even when that's dangerous, especially when that's dangerous.